Neal Battaglia, saxstation.com. All right, so this is the Soprano I got last week, and I bought it on eBay. And it shipped here from Wisconsin. I don't necessarily recommend you buy an old saxophone on eBay without ever trying it. Almost all the time, I'd recommend trying the saxophone you're going to get. If you've been playing saxophone for a little while, you'll have a much better sense of whether you like it, whether it feels comfortable, whether it has a tone you like, etc. If you haven't played saxophone, though, it's kind of hard to know whether a saxophone is good or not because in the first few days of playing saxophone, you probably can't play all the notes on the saxophone. And your tone's not going to be developed, so you're not necessarily going to sound like you want to on any saxophone if you haven't been playing the saxophone. So when you're first starting, it's kind of hard to know which saxophone to get. You kind of can listen. You can listen to other people. They probably have some recommendations. I have a page about different new saxophones. I checked out a lot of saxophones at the NAMM show. I've played a few different vintage horns myself, so you can listen to people and their opinions on different things. And you can read reviews, you can do things like that. But basically, you kind of just want to get something that people tend to like, and you're going to be learning to play the saxophone. So it's not going to sound exactly like you want it. Part of it's within your own body. A lot of it's within your own body. Most of it's within your own body, actually. So, but anyway, if you're going to get a saxophone and you've been playing a while, that's when you can test it out and you have a better idea of what certain things actually mean, whether you like them or not, whether it's something that you're going to be able to learn how to use or it's going to just be difficult to play later on. If, for example, you try to use saxophone and you just couldn't play a lot of notes, it's probably going to need some work. And actually, so I ordered the saxophone on eBay. I think it came from Wisconsin. And it's a saxophone from 1929. It's made by Conn. And I knew that it might have a really nice sound. I also knew it might need some work. And this first part was right, and the second part was right. So when I got it, it was kind of playable, but it had some issues. So the first thing that I actually noticed was I was playing some notes, and it was hard to play the low notes, but I could get them. It just was more difficult. It's like you can play low notes even with the octave key pressed. Like, all right. That was the G, middle G, with the octave key pressed. And you might have noticed it sounded kind of bad. That's because I was pressing the octave key. If you press the octave key, basically the physics of the horn is going to be different than what would be ideal to get that note. So if you literally are pressing the octave key and you try and play a low note, you can get it if you kind of know what the note sounds like and you control it. So that's what I just did. But you notice it didn't sound as good. Like a G is like... That's a G without the octave key, the normal way you would hear a G. And I'm going to need some time to get used to the soprano, so I'm going to sound better with some work, actually. But okay, so anyway, I got the saxophone, and I was able to play most of the notes. I played some higher notes, I played some lower notes. I'm actually not used to the top of the soprano, because those are higher notes than I usually play. Those are basically higher than the altissimo, or you probably could play the highest notes on the soprano on the alto or tenor, but it takes more work. They're just the palm keys on the soprano. So it's easier to play in terms of what your fingers do. It's like playing really high notes in the altissimo on an alto or tenor. So anyway, I was playing the different notes. It kind of played for the most part. I noticed when I was playing the E flat key that there was a little bit of an issue there. And actually, if you can see right there, yeah, you can see it right there. I replaced that cork right there. So the big piece of cork on the top above that ruler. I put that piece of cork on because there's basically nothing there. It might have fallen off at some point, but basically it was like metal on metal. It was clanking. And that's actually part of the function of the cork. It's to protect the metal. And if you can hear a clank, that's probably not a good thing. It means that the metal on metal contact done over a period of time may wear it down. So the corks help protect the metal of the saxophone. So that was the first cork that I replaced. And I was having trouble with the low notes. I wasn't quite sure what was going on. What happens actually is with the pads on the saxophone, anything up high, like the octave keypad is here, the primary one, and the secondary one is right here. So there's one here and one here, but there are also holes in the tube for the palm keys, which are here, here, and here. So they're here, the other two are up here. They're not too far apart. So if you have a leak in one of these pads, it's going to actually function kind of like the octave key being open. So I knew I was having trouble with low notes. I thought it might be some issues with the pads. So I took it to Gary Stotts, who does a lot of repairs on my instruments, and basically found that all three of these needed to be replaced. They were shot. And since this horn is from 1929, some of the pads were actually original, and some of them were worn down a lot. So he replaced these three, he replaced some pads somewhere here, and then he replaced one of the pads, I think, yeah, one of the ones down here. So, and the one down here actually wasn't as obvious because it was playing okay, but if you open it up, there's like, the leather was like coming apart. So it was kind of functional, but it was not really functional in a good way. It really should have been replaced. And these pads are really old. They're kind of made in a different style, so they're replaced with a newer kind of pad. There are a lot of options for pads out there. There's like Rue pads, the black ones. There's another company that makes a similar one. There's resonators. There's all these options. But basically, just you want pads that seal. That's the first thing. And on top of that, you can get the other options, which can make a difference. But the sealing of the pad is kind of the most important thing. If there are leaks, it can function like an extra octave key, which screws up the tone. That's just not good. So I was playing, and I had these pads replaced, and then I think at some point after I got it, one of the corks came loose. It was actually, let's see, the cork was replaced. And basically that's on the top. It's connected to the octave mechanisms and to the G key. The G key is actually what makes the saxophone go from the primary octave mechanism to the secondary octave mechanism. So I knew something weird was happening when I got to G, and basically I looked at it and I found out that because this cork was basically, I think it was either too thin or, yeah, I think it was too thin and maybe it had gotten bumped a little bit. But basically the cork wasn't thick enough, it wasn't in the right place. So when I pressed the G key and the octave key was down, it actually raised up the secondary mechanism even if I wasn't pressing the octave key. So that made it pretty hard to play the low notes. I mentioned earlier you can play the low notes when the octave is triggered, or even if the octave key is fully pressed. I think that tone hole was open maybe a quarter of the way or an eighth of the way. Not too much, but a significant amount to have an effect. You want basically the octave not to go too high, not to go too low. You really want that for any of the keys. There's kind of a certain distance that works well for the horn. But what happened was I was just pressing this key and the octave mechanism was going up. I took some video of that so you can see it. So I replaced the cork there, and things were better. I could play the low notes. They came out a lot better. And then I noticed another little piece of cork was kind of worn down quite a bit. So I was like, oh, okay, I can replace that too. I'm kind of an amateur saxophone repairman. I can't do a lot of things. Like I'm not going to try and like replace the pads myself because that requires some more work. I'm not necessarily going to take everything apart and clean it, because there's a lot of kind of nuance to the saxophone. If you tighten a screw too much, it can mess up the sound. If you put on a piece of cork that's too thick, I found out that can cause some problems. So I put this other piece of cork on because I knew there should be some cork there, but the piece I put was actually a little bit too thick. And what happened was I put a piece of cork here and it affected this key. So I put something here, a little piece of cork, and it affected if I could fully compress this key. And what actually happened was it made it harder to press it down. It didn't make it impossible, but it took a lot more force. And so if you didn't really squeeze on this key, it was hard to play the low notes. If you did squeeze, the low notes would come out. But if you didn't, this thing would be basically partially open. You'd be trying to press these keys, but this one would be open a little bit, and there would be problems. So basically, I took it back to the repairman. I took it back to Gary Stotts, and he saw that. And at first I thought I needed to like adjust something with this thing because like the problem was here, but it was actually caused by something up here. It was caused by that little tiny piece of cork that was too thick. So he saw that and he actually just sanded away that piece of cork. He just took it off. It's gone. And at this point, there's a little bit of a click, but not very much. Like a little tiny, tiny bit. Not really noticeable. If everything's clanking, like if this thing was clanking, and that's something you press with some force, that's maybe not a good thing. I'm pressing this key directly with my pinky. With this one, you're pressing something, something's lifting, and there's like maybe a little tiny, tiny bit of cork still there. I might put a super thin piece of cork there and I'll be okay. But if I put something that's too thick, it's going to cause that problem. He also replaced the cork on the neck because it had been worn down a lot. Sometimes you can use like a hair dryer and expand the cork a little bit, but this was like really old. It might have even been the original cork. I'm not sure. The story was on the eBay listing that someone was using this in a marching band last year. So I figured it was being played, but there was a lot of like original pieces on the saxophone, especially like the leather pads. In 1929, that means it's either 87 or 88 years old. So I put in one piece of cork that was helpful. I put in one piece of cork that I shouldn't have, and then we took that away. And now it's basically functioning. The saxophone plays all right. It has a pretty nice tone. I need to get used to playing the soprano. I started on clarinet, and then 3 months later I started playing the saxophone in addition to the clarinet. So I play clarinet quite a bit, and I still play it sometimes, especially for like a trip. It's a really compact instrument, so it's easy to take. You can even like put it in a backpack or something. You can carry it on a plane very easily, which is good. It's kind of scary when you check an instrument. I did check a tenor when I went to Nashville this last year, but I put it in a very, very sturdy flight case, like definitely built for flight. And I put in some extra like towels and cloth and tried to make it so it wouldn't move around, and it ended up being okay. The case was definitely designed for that. It had a lot of protection, very sturdy on the outside. But yeah, you can take an alto on board usually. You can take a tenor if it's a contoured case. If it's a little bit bigger, you might be able to. It kind of depends on whether they can fit it in the overhead bin. And you basically want to try and get the case, you want it to be sturdy, but you also want it to be as small as possible if you're going to carry it on a plane, especially for tenor. An alto is usually okay. A soprano, I think, would be fine. Clarinet's easy, piece of cake. I can put it in a backpack and bring it on. You can definitely put it in a piece of luggage as well. So yeah, so I still play the clarinet, and I took that in to get a little bit of work done too. One of the corks had kind of fallen, or I would say maybe a quarter of the cork was gone on the bottom of the instrument. So it's kind of functional, but it should have been replaced because it's eventually going to probably fail like that. So I brought in my clarinet, I brought in the soprano, and with some work, I did a little bit of work. I put on some pieces of cork. I tested out everything. I tried to figure out where the problems were. Gary Stott's used, I'm sure, a leak light to put a light inside the saxophone and see what things came out. And actually, even at home, I shone a flashlight when I had the problem with the cork, and I could see a leak here unless I pressed it really hard. So I knew that was kind of the issue, but I didn't immediately think of the cork as being the cause of the issue, which it turned out to be. So now I've got a pretty functional soprano. I'll probably need to get some of these other pads replaced at some point, but for now it's playing. Like I said, I started on the tenor, and I played a little bit of alto, like the first few years that I played, but not too much. Really, I kind of started to play alto more about maybe 4 years ago, and it's very similar to the tenor, which I mostly played. You put your fingers in the same place, you have a similar embouchure and everything, but it is a little bit different, and it takes some time to get used to it. It takes some hours of playing it to get used to it, and I think it's going to be exactly the same with the soprano. When I went down to the NAMM show, I have this video where I tried a bunch of sopranos, and I could kind of play them. I can play some things I know. They're in the same key as the tenor, so I know some songs for the tenor because it's my main saxophone. But at the same time, I knew I just wasn't really used to the saxophone, so that's going to take some work. But now I've got an instrument that functions. I think I can do that. It is an old horn, so it's going to be a little bit harder to play than some of the more modern saxophones. But at the same time, it seems to have a pretty nice tone if I put in some work and get used to it. This is Amateur Saxophone Repairman, episode number 1. And I could talk about some other things that I've done on some of my other horns, the repairs that I can make myself. I do definitely take it in when I need to. I'm not an expert at repairing instruments, but I can make a few small repairs myself, especially if they're simple. If it's like a piece of a cork that's basically isolated, it's easier to deal with. If it doesn't, like, this cork affects other things that I didn't necessarily think of. But at the same time, now I know that. I know that a piece of cork here will affect the hole under the G key, which was interesting and good to know now. And I could probably help more people with that too if they had the same problem. So if you want to try and do some repairs on your saxophone, you want to be really careful. I probably wouldn't recommend messing with the pads yourself. You can probably, I know people have replaced this cork at the top on the neck before. Some little pieces of cork on here, like this one, was simple. I just cut a piece, made it about the right thickness, and glued it on. I used Gorilla Glue, which is like super glue. You want to be careful with that, though. You don't necessarily want to use any glue on the pads. And really, I kind of don't do work on the pads myself. I take it to someone who knows more about what they're doing. But since I do play the saxophone, I can oftentimes figure out what's going on. And if you can figure out what's going on, that can help the repair person get to the actual problem quicker, which can be a good thing.